Hello and welcome to Liminal Light, a show that explores Earth and sky and the spirits that reside there through art, literature, lore, myth, and magic. I'm your host, Chris. Enjoy. All right, well, I'm here today with Samuel McCabe, magician and teacher of magic. How you doing?
Pretty good.
And so you teach magic basically at is it exclusively at Ritualcravt School in Denver?
Yes, yeah.
And they have a lot of courses going on there.
They do. They have a lot of courses from like tarot to specific traditions to just basic things like mirror scrying. Yeah, it's a very wide range of classes that are offered there. And
you lead rituals there and have like reading groups and things like that.
Yeah, I lead the Ritualcravt book coven, which is a bi-weekly book club. It's very, very democratic. We pick out, which books we want to read, and then read them together, a chapter at a time. And at the last few meetings, we've been doing things with dream work. We made dream journals, and we all consumed dream tea before, going in and writing down some dreams, and then we're able to share them as a group later on. So it's a very collaborative group. And then the Ides Moon rituals that I lead, those are once a month on the Ides, so either on the 13th or the 15th of the month. And with those, what we're exploring is actual workings from medieval and Renaissance grimoires in group settings.
Oh, cool.
So yeah.
Yeah, I like that. The book group also like getting into like putting ink to page, with your dreams, and then kind of it's like with the grimoires in general, like for thinking around the idea that like, well, if you really like books, you can actually like step into this book and spend the rest of your life there.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what the grimoires kind of poses, that they're in some ways they're a workbook that you can go through, but they're also so many of them revolve around the magical consecration of ink and paper, because I think the intent is that you eventually record your own grimoire.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I was going to get into that kind of as my last question, but since it's like come up now, that's one of the things that I'm really interested in is like kind of late goetia practice or like off book practice, like where you're like, okay, I've been doing this for a while and now it's like taken on a life of its own and might not even resemble the structure of the grimoire anymore, because like each relationship with each spirit has like led to certain allowances, like they're like, oh, that's okay if you just contact me in the middle of the day any old time, or you can call me by this name, that's fine, and then things start to just really go off in kind of a tangential direction, and that sometimes the tools and rules of the presented in the books like end up being only kind of in emergency situations, like after a while, or has that been your experience?
I mean, I definitely think that there's something to be had about starting out with the grimoire and practicing to fidelity. I think that there's something to be learned about the self-discipline of choosing propitious times, the care and attention put into something like making incense or ritual garments or the circle. And I think that along the way, you do build relationships with spirits, and you really start to understand like that some of them could be, contacted in, an emergency situation at, any time of the day. Others are going to be a little bit more stricter to the actual grimoire and what it is. And I think that too, like we have hundreds of years of literature that revolves around the nature of spirits, and there's a long history of this, and so many things that have been written down, from the medieval times to even in Byzantine times, things dating back to the PGM. There's certain components of how spirits interact with people that just can't be cast off. But at the same time, I do think that with Goetia, there is room to really personalize it as how the spirits appear to you. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, then, that kind of like, as I totally agree that, it's like you got to start with the techniques, because you see the parallels from one grimoire to the next with variation, and then you can kind of look at across the whole thing and be like, oh, well, I think this is kind of what they're getting at, like, because there's information missing in some. Like, I think this is the purpose of this, and that's the purpose of that, and that only really comes with the practice, and being like, oh, okay, I see why that was necessary, because I had it there and I ended up using it, or I didn't have it there and this happened, or whatever. And then you might not even realize something was necessary, like a certain element of consecration, until way down the line, where you're like, oh, that never really mattered, and then this kind of information like came about, and you're like, oh, well, that really makes sense. Like, it might just be for kind of tempering and like clarifying the signal, rather than just being like it won't work or it will work. And then other things you're just like, yeah, it's not going to happen without that,
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, like, I guess I was saying, like, kind of, after you've been practicing for so many years, that, that like personalization that you're talking about can kind of seep its way into like how you approach art, or taking it into client work, or devotional work, or I know, like, in like Kimbanda, what they call firmeza, that Jake Stratton Ken has referred to in grimoire practice as like a night in with the boys, like where you just kind of like, instead of conjuring them and saying like, now do this, or specific kind of binding or something, it's kind of like, okay, this is the kind of things that spirit likes, so we're going to kind of just like light their altar up and like make a night of it,
Yeah. I think that's kind of, what eventually, a magician who's working with spirits is going to be doing, is they're going to have kind of in a way, a posse of spirits that they work with. And yeah, sometimes it's just like, let's light up the place with this spirit, and really let them come through. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, like I found like some of them like even having people over to play cards, like things like that. Like, they're like, yeah, I just want you to play poker, or things like that, because there's like gambling magic like threads through a lot of the the grimoires, and that was like an objective to kind of like win money and be able to like cheat people and do like kind of like on the fly kind of divinations, and then you'll realize in doing that there are these kind of weird synchronicities and signals like in the card game that they're trying to like impart to you, where you're like, man, I saw like this one like card come up over and over and over, and it's not that much different from like a divination, like a cartomantic divination that they just kind of like organized for you or whatever,
Yeah.
But yeah, so, and then do you end up like taking work with spirits from the grimoires out into the landscape, and does that move into your and how you interact with like place and plants and animals and or like just the energy of your own body or your physical experience or things like that?
I definitely think there's something to be had about really recognizing the space you're in. For so many odd number of years, I lived in Vermont before moving to Colorado, and I can tell you, like, just the difference of landscape and how spirits kind of respond in those different areas. Currently living in Colorado, there's it's very dry, like in Denver, in the Front Range, and very flat until you get to the mountains. But there's a very high elevation, and so the plants are specialized to that landscape. And I think recently this summer I took a trip to Black Canyon, which is kind of on the western slope of Colorado, and just noticing the spirit activity there, and some of the the ones that kind of come with me when I go to a place like that. The energy is definitely heightened, I find, like when I'm out in nature. I live in the city currently, and so as we read in grimoires, like it's spirit work in a very metropolitan area is not like, it's not like best practice in a way, because there's so much traffic going on. There's so many people. It's really hard to find privacy in that. And so anytime like I can get out into the landscape and interact with it, through the plants, through the rocks, I treasure that moment.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because I find sometimes the opposite thing happens with me living in a rural area, where when I visit a city, some of the spirits that I work with are like, oh, this is amazing. There's like, we need you to do this at this crossroad. There's a cemetery down there. Like, go leave this at this church, like, which is funny. Like there's like some opportunistic nature there, they're like,
There is.
They'll use whatever's around you.
Yeah. And I think like too, there's a difference between like very urban magic and rural magic. And yeah, like just different places in the city, like some of the alleys like in my neighborhood have a lot of really nice liminal kind of activity or setting. And yeah, crossroads in different places, like in the city, you have to be a little bit more, I guess, discreet about leaving offerings and things like that, depending on the time of day and depending on what they are. But yeah, I do like the juxtaposition, like the between like urban and rural magic at this point. It does kind of, it makes it more interesting, I guess.
Yeah. Before we get too ahead of the conversation,
sure.
For people that are like, what are these guys talking about? What is goetia?
So I guess this is just kind of like my definition of it, but it's a practice of conjuration with spirits, conjure being to swear together. And so these are spirits that they're not angelic. They are, they're found in several grimoires, kind of culminating in the classical grimoire or classical goetia with like the Ars goetia, which is the lesser key of Solomon. But these are spirits that typically you can see them as trickster spirits. You could see them as demons. I kind of refrain from calling them demons, but that's kind of the, I guess, mainstream society's perspective on them and how they would classify them. And so I guess there's also protocol in there, like how to set up a ritual within this goetia, certain things like a circle and a steel blade, an incense.
And yeah, like a list of protocols to kind of just protect yourself, set up the space, and make the thing happen. And then,
right.
And then what is the purpose for for like bringing these spirits like to conversation?
I think there's different purposes in there. Each spirit has a very specific office that they hold. That's what they will work with people with, and so it kind of depends on how you work with them, on what you get. Some people might work with them for love magic or money magic or something like that. Some people may, kind of push the envelope a little bit and call it a very, similar to like a devotional practice. I'm not quite of that ilk. I think that your own personal morality has to come out of that, independent of your work with the spirits. But I guess the biggest thing is that the spirits offer different services, and if you get along with them well, you form a relationship. Excuse me. You can usually get some results out of that, but it varies, and it's definitely one of those kind of practices that you really have to persevere through, because a lot of the time it's not as glamorous as I think the movies are.
Yeah, that's funny to say, like non-glamorous.
It's not.
yeah, and it's definitely like a slog. And then there's like you could be a few years in and be like, is this even working? Did I just dedicate like a massive amount of time to this? Like, is this even like really happening?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that like too, there's a weight placed upon actual spirit appearance, and I would have to argue that that's like a huge benchmark, because I think in my early years, like that it was pretty dodgy, like whether or not spirit contact was actually made, and whether or not it was just kind of like either tired or like just not actually getting contact. And it's kind of one of those things where your first like true physical appearance contact it's either you got lucky, you got a really responsive spirit, or you pushed through and you kept invoking until something really changed and you actually got that appearance. But I think that's a huge piece of it.
Yeah, the physical visual is interesting, because like I know we messaged before a lot about like the imagination's role, and kind of what the imagination does, and whether or not it's so active or so passive, and how much of your imagination that are you filtering into, like not allowing yourself to see what you could be seeing, just compartmentalizing, and then also kind of like understanding how your own thoughts, like it's helpful to have some sort of meditation practice or some sort of way of being like, I know what my mind is like when it's kind of on automatic, and when because a lot of the spirit conversation is going to be your imagination in a kind of dialogue with a non-native imagination, and that some of that is going to happen in the exterior, like in your what you can physically sense, and some of it's going to happen on the interior. But that like you're saying is a benchmark, like did you see it, did something happen, and then even establishing like, well, did I really see that, because sometimes you're like, oh yeah, like looking at, say you're looking at an altar or something, and the light in front of you just totally bends and stretches or something, and you're like you said, like, am I just tired, or like am I a little dizzy? But you're like, no, I saw like it looked like it just like totally stretched out, and I kind of saw the form of a kind of visage there or something,
Yeah, I definitely think that there's kind of with that there's a trust that you develop with your imagination, and there's for me, like, and you were kind of mentioning it, I don't know if it was in that context, but kind of body sensation, or body work. For me, like I do tune into like the sensations that my body is receiving. Like say if I'm in the shower, noticing like the temperature of the water, noticing like if there's a chill because my window's open, like really being aware of each sensation to the point where when I'm in the circle, I can go back and do that, and it becomes my awareness is telling me this, and part of that is imagination, but there's also a very sensorial kind of feeling that goes on. There's almost like the room has like a buzzing kind of quality to it, and lights kind of take on a different kind of glow in a way. There's just some changes that take place, and part of it is just noticing it very objectively, being able to maybe record that in a journal, but also allowing for the play of the light, allowing for those things.
Yeah, and like you said, like temperature changes, like you could get goosebumps or feel like the pressure in the room change, or just feel like there's a kind of like almost animal, like fear feeling responses, like like when something spooks you and you feel this like kind of like flush through your whole body, like some cool liquid just goes through your body or something, or even natural phenomenon, like in the like I've had like it suddenly start pouring rain, or that the house gets surrounded by owls all of a sudden, or I've had the power go out,
Yeah, all those things like are kind of a part of it. It's like noticing like, yeah, there's clicks in the room, or really odd stuff, and sometimes it is really odd stuff, like you're saying, like owls appearing. Were they all like the same kind of owls, or?
Yeah, it was like there was all of a sudden, like I'm not sure what species they were, but it was all the same call, all the same kind of hoot, and they were like, there's probably like 5 or 6 of them just surrounding the house. That was pretty good.
Stolus working, or?
No, it was just like it was like a divination, but we're kind of getting off track, but this is not like just I'm about to, but like I've noticed, like, since I've been working a lot with the lunar mansions and the PGM list of animals, like that, like equal 28, and since then, so much of like results, like synchronistic results, come from animals, and it's like all different animals all the time.
Wow.
It's just kind of being like, I've been doing a lot of kind of, I'll do a kind of initial call through Hecate, and then I'll go into a mode where I'm like, if it's the mansion that corresponds to that animal, kind of getting into the movements of that animal and kind of moving around the room as that animal, and then I'll proceed into spirit work after that. But since then, like, the animal synchronicities have just been off the chain, but I saw that you were doing a class about augury.
Yeah. So for me, like, and I've always had a relationship with birds, and right now, in a couple weeks, I'm going to teach this class on auguries at Ritualcravt, and we're actually going to go into a local park and teach the class, and then we'll do some field work with making observations, making predictions, coming together and kind of discussing those things. But yeah, I've always had a relationship with birds. At one point, I was working at a raptor rehabilitation center.
Oh, wow.
And so part of that work was, feeding and caring for owls and hawks. And I was assigned a cage of short-eared owls. They're these kind of small owls. They're a little bit bigger than a screech owl, but smaller than a great horned. And they live in marshy areas on the ground. They're in these low kind of trees. But yeah, I just kind of working with birds in that way, when they give you eye contact, they're trying to tell you something.
Yeah.
And so that relationship just, carries on. And even when I was little and I lived in a very rural setting, and so great horned owls were a thing. And sometimes at night, like, I remember hearing rabbit screams as these great horned owls would come in and take out a rabbit. And
usually in the morning, there in the front yard, there'd be like this decapitated rabbit carcass. And I guess the animal kingdom does have things that it can, teach just by paying attention and learning kind of the personal ways it connects with you. With auguries, there's certain parameters for this, reading the skies. But a lot of it's very intuitive, and a lot of it can be very personal in what this sign, like if birds are coming in from, say, the northwest, and they're this kind of bird, and they're, there's this many of them, and they're flying in this pattern, that might mean something completely different for someone else. The directions have a little bit to do with it, but really a lot of it's just personal work and going through it. But I think that in the classes that I teach, sometimes it's not really the content that's being taught, it's the platform, and that people are able to come together and talk about magic in a safe, inclusive environment, where the expectation is that everyone's a student. It really it takes everything down a notch. It takes it down to a point where people feel comfortable talking about it. It doesn't have to be about who's right or wrong, and the end result is that it inspires people to continue doing this work.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that makes you think about when we were saying about like after 3 years or say or something of practice, that you kind of are like, well, this, you start second guessing some of it or something. You're like, is this really happening? And of course, there's times you have results, but you can start being like, it's good to be critical of yourself to prove to yourself that things are occurring, but that's a good, like you said, platform for that to like take it out of your interior monologue and start like a discourse and get people able to just kind of be like, oh, well, this is what I have going on, or questioning like, what do you do about this, or it's taking it out of like that kind of isolated state, because it gets a little uninteresting sometimes being completely a solo practitioner,
Oh, totally. Yeah, there's no way of checking in or like feeling a part of a larger community, and I think community can kind of feel community has the potential to be kind of messy if everyone is up on top of each other. But if there's room to breathe within it, where traditions are being explored, there's respect going on, and people don't feel like it's a matter of authorities and students, but that everyone's a student and everyone's learning, and everyone has the ability to share their own discoveries. That I think is kind of what creates community. But yeah, I mean, for years, like I practiced and had no, anyone to talk about this, before like the internet really became a hub to meet new people, that were practitioners. When I lived in Vermont, I don't know if Maine has a what you might call a community. Do you find that?
No. There's just like a handful of people that kind of come and go,
Yeah.
But someone else might be like, "What's he talking about?" There's absolutely a community, but it's not. We're doing different things or something.
Right.
But yeah, I like what you're saying about that. Like, we were talking kind of in correspondence about these things, like grimoire practice becoming a living tradition, and how can it become that? What are the components? And there's a lot of different components, and you can kind of go deep with that question. And some people might answer, well, it can never be. It's like purely textual, and that's the way it's transmitted. And other people might say something else, like it needs to be plugged into these elements of what a culture does, and then it's up and running, but not until then. But obviously, like the first thing for it to be a living tradition is that people are communicating with each other and being in presence with one another.
Yeah, and I think that what keeps it alive is that there's new insight being funneled into it. I think that as we look at how the grimoires were transmitted and the scope of that transmission, when through the diaspora, into more of the New World traditions, and looking at the full scope of grimoires within that, it's constantly evolving. I don't think of. I think there are certain things, like if you look at like a Solomonic ritual outline, that's pretty much unchanged, but maybe some of the, for some people, including new technology into magic, whether it's through apps or cell phones, things like this. You can tell I don't do that. But I don't know what they. But I know like there's and also with the exploration of things like different psychedelics or entheogens, things like this. I think there's room for looking at different things that can in some ways enhance it, but also there's just a tradition that goes along with it that. But I don't think it's everything has to be done just as it was done in the Renaissance times. I think that would be severely limiting the scope of it. Even limiting it, like if you were just working with one grimoire, I think you'd miss out on the scope of all the spirits and some of the other writing on them. So yeah, that's kind of how I take living tradition. With something like goetia.
I can see that. Like it itself is as a tradition is inhabited and has an intelligence, and that it's allowed to develop and change over time because it's alive.
Mm-hmm.
I love the augury stuff, and I was wondering when I saw that with the kind of relations of the spirits with the fallen angels and some of the etymology of the spirits sort of seeming to relate to like predatory birds of prey and how that intersects with like the Lucifer story. And do you ever bring any of the spirits into augury practice?
There are some spirits that teach learning the language of birds. I think Kame is one that comes to mind with that. There's some other ones as well. And yeah, I think that work, that relationship helps foster that. But I think that that's an innovation that happened in magic, and that it's not necessarily necessary. I think a lot of it kind of goes back to those early traditions of animism and connecting with animals, and that forming relationships with the animal world is kind of how that comes about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I think it's like it would be an added step if like my route into auguries was something that required a lot of prerequisites, and not just going out into the yard or a park or just an open space and just observing. It kind of goes back to when I was doing that work at the Raptor Rehabilitation Center. This was in Yellow Springs, Ohio. That there was a connection that I was forming with the land, and it was independent a lot of times, or at least it wasn't a conscious magical expression. When I would go out into the woods, oftentimes I would have nothing on me. It would just be me in the woods, observing, experiencing, interacting. And so sometimes I think that the bonds we form with nature don't necessarily need a magical routine or structure in order to connect. And that's very just simplified, but yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
Oh yeah, no, that's great. And it's kind of like the other way around, that some of the spirits of the grimoires maybe ended up being on the lists because people starting with like deep connections with spirits of place and with elemental spirits and spirits of animals and things like that, and that kind of relationship ended them up as like worth calling, but that it doesn't. But the other way around, like you're saying, isn't necessary. Like you don't need a ritual protocol to go out and connect with the spirit of a bird or a spirit of like of plants that you might find in the landscape. And I guess I kind of I almost desensitized myself to that by living rural for so long. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that it's people aren't connecting with nature,
Yeah. And definitely when I was in Vermont and living a very rural existence, it just became second nature. And it was, I don't know, there's a different time that goes on in nature. It's if you talk about liminality, time doesn't have the same pace as it does, say, in a city or in your home. And to tap into that is to kind of get back into the weave, and it becomes so second nature when it becomes a daily practice. It's I don't see the demarcated line between my time in nature versus my time outside of it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's interesting you say that. I've been thinking about animals' experience of time and our earliest experiences of time as humans, being, and that everyone's counting, that time counting kind of pulses and rhythms and feeding cycles and circadian rhythms and I guess with humans we started paying a lot of attention to the sky and counting and keeping track of the wandering stars and things like that. But that all animals are doing some sort of pace keeping, and that it's much rounder or spiraling or kind of it has, like you said, the weave. It has a different pattern than linear time, which is just measurement, and even in magical results, you could say, I did this, and then this person ended up giving me this book, and it had this information in it that was exactly what I was looking for, and that was what the spirit delivered. But you're but they actually bought me that book for my birthday last year and forgot to give it to me, so that doesn't make any sense. But that's maybe getting too caught up in the linear time measurement, where you're calling a table 48 inches rather than calling it a table,
Yeah.
You're well, it doesn't. Don't look at the ruler. Look at what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely how I kind of. Magic is a modality to connect with the spirit world. But prior to things like grimoires and written magic or learned magic, and even some of those folk traditions that came out before that, it was just humans and nature, and it was it was direct experience. And I think as civilization progressed, people began to disconnect a little bit from the natural processes and the a very natural existence, and had to come up with ways to get back to those experiences.
Yeah, that's really well put. So kind of along that line, so where do the spirits I think you used the term like offices before, and I use that sort of as an analogy sometimes too, like like sometimes as why do they have different names, or why, or to kind of understand the hierarchy, like if you were to contact me and ask me to do something while I was like working as a bartender, I might not have the same availability in response to you. Or if you contacted me and asked me to do something while I was like at a family reunion, I might not even have the same personality at all than I would if you contacted me in my home, or like at like a concert or something, and that like, so why you need to kind of go in and locate the spirits in a certain way and in a certain order, but also what does that all hang on? Like whether it be the decons or the mansions, and like in physical space, what would be the reason for that? And if those are kind of places they live, or spaces that are part of their maybe spiritual body or what they resonate with, are there other spirits that also live or work in that office with them? Like, is it kind of like an office space that a different variant spirits could occupy simultaneously, and they all have different things they could do? I'm kind of just like setting up a whole bunch of ideas that like, and wondering what you think about them.
I mean, I think that there's, so, you have like several different spirit lists, and there's kind of some common threads. Either it's with the actual spirits in the lists, the order. Jake Stride and Ken talks about 18ness, and how most of the lists have kind of a solid set of the first 18 are a lot of times very similar. And then when you look at the spirit list a little bit deeper, you see that certain ones have different names that you can call them by, and sometimes calling them by a different name activates a different like specialty. I'm thinking specifically of one, Barith, where I believe it's in Discovery of Witchcraft. Scott talks about Bolfrey is how he's called by necromancers, and so he's got kind of this title. He's got his office, kind of what that spirit does, and then there's different names that you can contact it by, and depending on the list, you might see something like planetary attributes or decanic attributes, and I think it's kind of our the left brain trying to like organize this data, this information, and so sometimes the best way to do it is just make a list.
Totally.
Because or the idea that like these spirits are related in some way, that they have a certain quality and a nature and things like that, but the appearance of them, the ways they interact, the idea that there's a hierarchy, meaning that there's some that are more powerful than others, it adds a complexity to the spirit work, and so I don't view the I don't view the spirits, in a particular grimoire as like all cronies necessarily. Right. I mean, they're all in there, but they're, and there's some structure there, but the origins of them at times are very, very different.
Right.
Some of them are considered to be fallen angels. We could probably argue that all of them are considered sublunar, but some are definitely have a very infernal feeling to them, and some cross those boundaries. So there's there's this complexity to it that's really fascinating, and it's been compiled in this way for centuries. But yeah, kind of picking it apart, I think that the idea, to kind of wrap this up, like in a way, is to really look at individual spirits and look at maybe how they relate to other spirits, but what are their, what are they like, outside of the confines of a grimoire?
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite ways to approach that is sort of by thinking of it in physical space. So you can so I do like the Decon and Mansion models for that you can contemplate it astrologically, but then, and even with astrology, I like to make sure that it connects back to your physical reality, like that you can go outside, look at the first house by looking east and look at the seventh house by looking west, and you can look at the stars as they go across the sky, and think about the Decons as a physical place, or the mansions as a physical place, and kind of contemplate why a particular spirit might resonate with that, even if it's just the only reason why that works is just as for timing, and like you're saying, who knows? Because some of them might be in there for different reasons. One could be actually a human person at one point that worked magic really hard and made kind of underworld connections, and then is still available, and is actually more like a really powerful ghost or almost a saint, like a secular saint, but that somehow you can ring their doorbell when this portion of the sky is kind of in a certain position or something. But and with 18ness, I noticed about that Jake says it, but thinking about the mansions, that they you have the 18, and then before that you have the three chiefs and their two deputies each. Right. And then with the Verum plus Skirlin gives you 10, and then you get the 28. And then it seems like the Bibliotech Blue grimoires seem to resonate with the mansions as a timing model, or kind of where the spirits live model, more than and they're referred to as chthonic spirits, and it sort of makes sense that you're in the lowest zone. You're not even a lot of planetary observance is necessary when you do a mansion election, even for a talisman, say out of the Picatrix. The elections are much simpler. You're just working with the immediate, and that those books are more considered diabolical. They're you don't have to go as high up. You don't have to get as complex. You're just trying to get stuff done. Whereas with the 72 or the Key of Solomon, you get are often thought of more as aerial spirits, and that sort of makes sense in this way that they'd root more into the Decons, where with Egyptian stellar ritual, where the Decons come from, you're really, really concerned with the ascendant all the time. You're always concerned with what stars on the eastern horizon. And then you get that whole kind of directional model, where east often is considered fire and west air, but you're still on that lateral kind of that's where the four kings seem to become really important, because you're on this kind of horizontal. And even in astrology, the glyphs for the air signs are all have a horizontal nature, like Aquarius with the air, the kind of air currents or water currents going right to left, or the scales in Libra, or I don't know. It's interesting to think about I don't know. I just not to make it abstract that way, to be okay, so if they relate to the Decons and mansions, etc., that you need to get on the computer and start producing charts, which you kind of do to a degree, but you also, it means maybe you should go outside and look east,
Yeah.
Or look up and look at the moon,
Yeah. I think there's definitely the early astrologers I think we're more in tune with the sky than we are now, even though we have the technology to show us everything, but yeah,
I think that there is something to the spirits and kind of those attributes of the decans, and that was really that was pretty profound. I mean, I hadn't thought about the aerial spirits being, as you're saying, more decanic or deconic, and the mansions being the more chthonic ones. Is that?
Yeah, that's just like kind of how I've found it most recently, and it kind of makes sense with the way the numbers add up. Like I don't want to say the numerology, but with like the 18ness and the 72, and like because the 72 is 36 twice, and then with the mansions and the 18 of the Bibliothèque Bleue kind of era stuff being like the 18 and the 10 superiors being 28, But yeah, I don't know. It's and it's more like the animalistic, and like that it's like it has an animal layer and then the diabolical layer, or
yeah. It is kind of interesting too, though, that with those Bibliothèque Bleue grimoires, that they're related to things like the Key of Solomon, but there's kind of a distinction in there that's a little bit different, and there's some things that are very similar. You have things like the pen and ink in the paper parchment, but it is interesting that some things aren't as important in those grimoires as is in something like the Key of Solomon, with something like ritual garments. You don't see a lot of mention about that in Bibliothèque Bleue books, which are books for lay people, versus something like a manuscript grimoire of like the Key of Solomon.
Yeah, and it's weird. You can almost see it like turning into like chaos magic. You can almost see, as there being such late grimoires, like being in the hands of like Austin Osman Spare or something, and like like the one of the things you say in Grimorium Verum is like hold on, I'm changing modalities here in my mind, but like to let me accomplish it in my work what I see in my mind, or something like that. Like you start seeing these, and that goes back even to the Hygromantia being like, this is going to work, even in the Picatrix too, like this is going to work best if you believe in it, but you start seeing that really stick out more in the late ones, where they're like, what's happening in my mind, let me see it happen like in what I do. And it's funny that they even use the word like in my work, it's kind of almost like becomes almost like a conjure, like hoodoo kind of concept, where they're like, let the materials I'm working be connected to my imagination, and then let that bring results. So it's kind of starting to see like the bones of the thinking that led to like kind of sigil construction.
Yeah, I mean, there's an immediacy to them that's very different from like if you look at something like the Abermelin kind of tradition, like where 18 months of prayer and confession and not a lot going on, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I see this thing. It's just like a very long extended ritual, while something like the Grimoire Pope Honorius or the Verum, like it's just like today on Monday.
Yeah, right.
It's like we have an hour.
Yeah,
we're do it now.
Totally. that's a great way to put it. You're like, what day is it? All right, yeah, let's go.
Yeah, all right. Showed on Friday. Like, it's just there's, and that's like, I think what I really, when I started to and in how like you progress magically, I started out with something like Key of Solomon, was like, wow, this is going along here, and then like to have the Pope Honorius grimoire like plop in your lap, and it's like, oh, I can do this tomorrow. I like that a lot, because I think that it gives you more opportunities to experiment more, and there's
the results in my own reading are a little bit more defined, and so it's less about contacting some very abstract concept of an angel to something that's like I was saying with Bashod, like Bashod likes a nut. He do stuff with weather magic. It's like, okay, I got this.
Right.
I don't know. It just, and I mean, I think that like with chaos magic, I can see how Spare would really take to something like this, kind of like I did. But I do think there's I wouldn't call what I'm doing chaos magic in any way. I mean, I think there's a time and a place, and I think that for some people it resonates, but that's one that never really got with it never took a hold of me quite like something like Goetia.
Yeah.
I do like kind of there's a level of pomp that I like. There's a level of that that really gets me into that headspace. I was reading things like Peter Carroll. I was like, so I'm drawing this sigil, which reminds me of Picatrix's work, but there's a lot less preparation for that, and it didn't click with me.
Yeah, I think I've back in the day I got some things I wanted to get with like chaos magic, but I didn't find myself, like we're talking about living tradition, I didn't find myself wrapped up in a whole world that both fascinated me but also sort of like fed me and like made me more philosophically complete and led me towards like spiritual realizations, and like it just was kind of like I could get like a thing I wanted to have like more easily than normal or something.
I do too think about like as we were talking about the aims of something like Goetia, like the outcomes, and something like looking at like Arbitel work or the Sworn book of Honorius. They seem to have very, and the term theurgical gets thrown around a lot, and it's this idea of contact with the divine and ascension and things like this. But when you get into Bibliotech Blue books, it's not necessarily about ascension. It's about the work you're doing in this realm right now, and that deeply resonates with me. Because it's not an escapism. It's not a leave.
Right.
It's work with what you have, and I think that's why you have that kind of infernal trinity, with Lucifer and Beelzebub and Astaroth, or Satan. You have these rulers over the here and now. And you can contact them in the here and now, and it's a little bit it doesn't have the necessarily morality attached to it. You kind of like develop that on your own, and I think that's where we haven't really talked about this, like something like my Saint Cyprian work comes into it, because through maybe having a patron saint or working closely with an angel, then you get that kind of that ethical piece of the equation that is missing from something like just straight Goetia or Bibliotech Blue books.
Yeah, it's actually, it reminds me of like for years I was like going to India a lot, and I was very interested in this. It's not really tantra, but it's similar, like Agora tradition, like Agora sadhus like are go very, very, they're like eat meat, they have sex, they like they get completely wild and crazed and live in the charnel grounds and eat brains of corpses and like they're trying to condition themselves to be able to reach Shiva, say, or Tara, like even in the most like disgusting state, that like they can they call it like fast and terrible. Like you, instead of having to be reborn 1,000 times, you can do it all in one go if you just if you just go as terrible as possible. And so they're tangoing directly with like these animal natures, of like sex and carnivorous, like mammals and all, and like death and all this stuff. And that reminds me of like Hecate being triple formed or triple faced, and that kind of symbolizing in the Greco-Roman, Greco-Egyptian world of like the thrice as being like universal, as being like above, here and below, or ocean, earth, and sky, or whatever. And it's that kind of like that, what you're saying, like the three chiefs being the here and now rather than the ascensional component, but that even in Agora, like in that form of like Indian spirituality, you have a guru who keeps you from going off the rails, and that like saint kind of practice, or like working with an angel or a patron saint, in that sense is kind of your guru, but kind of on the other side,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it kind of it's a nice like kind of structure, I think, to have with it, like to have work with spirits on many different levels, and just kind of round it all out, because they're, like we were talking earlier, like they all have offices, they all have things that they kind of specialize in, and to work with that. But like to work with something very chthonic or very infernal, depending on your terminology, like I think it rounds things out a little bit. And I think that the kind of the larger component of that is the recognition of death, the recognition of that temporal nature that we have, that sometimes I think when you're only working with celestial hierarchies, you kind of miss, because it's in the opposite direction. If you're working with something like Hecate, or one of the goetia spirits, or a different deity that kind of like a chthonic Apollo, you're keeping one root, one foot kind of rooted in the underworld a little bit, because that is where your physical body is going to end up. And so it's kind of I think about kind of that going back to like my Kabbalah days, like the Adam Kadmon, like this like fully embodied person that has they're way up in the top with Keter, you have your kind of that celestial realm, and then down in Malkut you have the earth. And I think that's kind of where I take things. It's like I like to work with it all, because I think it really rounds out things well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I don't think it's not like we don't have to have any reference point to transcendental layers, or like very high up layers, or I don't know. I don't even really want to call them up necessarily.
Yeah.
Like, because I feel like it's like the whole Neoplatonic model, that and even its roots, it's not like Plato necessarily just pulled it out of his ass, but like it has. There was things people are talking about, like they, some people point out that it appears that like alphabets and Abrahamic religion and law all occurred kind of right in the same time, and that that obsession with the transcendental and getting out of the earth, is maybe even why we had a lot of kind of religious turmoil over the whole Christian period, and maybe like even understood Christianity falsely almost the entire time. That it might return to usefulness in some sense, like, because we can't just erase it from our own history and be like, well, that was wrong, but that we just didn't even, that in the future we might be able to proceed without dogma, and
right,
and like have it be a useful engagement of of beings that are less embodied, and kind of like you're saying, be more well-rounded of here and other than here, but it's possible that upward transcending kind of the less physical it is, the better it is, like theurgical kind of model also gave us kind of like the internet and like, like at first Christianity, then the internet, then science, then the internet, or, it's like responsible for like cryptocurrency, and like,
right.
It's like, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that like, that is part of too, like the work of, kind of reclaiming. We live, if people want to talk about like a Christian society, like I wouldn't say that means adherence to a particular faith at this point, but if you look at how much Christianity has shaped society, like it's phenomenal. Like there's so much of it. So much of it was shaped by Christianity holding hands with the church. And I also believe that currently what's happening in magical communities is people are getting a little bit more comfortable with the idea of Christianity separated from the church, because the church did a lot of things that we don't even need to get into because we already know them, but to kind of reclaim some of the aspects, because there's magical technology within Christianity that's super useful. Things like the saints and angels, and the ability to contact them in different ways without this feeling that, if you're not talking to the Holy Trinity components in isolation, you're not working in a Christian framework, which is false. I'm kind of looking for that trend to really catch a little bit, because a lot of the Luciferian practice, or looking at like satanic practice, like it just seems to be an inversion instead of like a real integration of the components of it. And I understand that some people had very horrifying experiences within a church, myself included, but at the same time, like, it can't just be a flip. It has to be something else. It has to be pulling out, because otherwise it complicates the grimoires. It complicates them if you're doing an invocation for, and I'm looking back at like, Pope Honorius, the grimoire there, you're using the Holy Trinity names in there for a specific reason, and just to flip-flop them, it messes with the structure. It complicates it. And there are certain invocations, say in the book of Saint Cyprian, where you are invoking Lucifer, but you're doing it with God the Son and the Holy Ghost, because it wouldn't make sense to invoke Lucifer with by invoking Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Satan. It wouldn't make sense. You have to have some kind of context for it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, that whole, I forget, I can't mention like the what passage it is, but when Jesus says at some point in the Bible, like, I call upon Beelzebub to like do this, like, who do you guys call upon, because and looking at the roots of Christianity as being sort of like like a on the road, the roads were dangerous places between cities, and there were these kind of people who were kind of ritual specialists who, especially for exorcisms, and the world outside of the city was still like very haunted. If there wasn't a community there, like, it was wild, and so people could get easily possessed, and then there were people who could like help them out of that. And that, even the church, went, way off on its own tangent. But, even like with the clergy, you're like, well, yeah, they have to be ascetical and have that moral dogma that they're trying to deliver to you to do the sacrament, because they're extreme ritual specialists. That's how they're able to do the deed. And that Christianity and all these religions are magical technologies to deal with the afterlife. And with the grimoires, they're like, say, do it exactly this and this, do it exactly like this, and it'll work. You have to, but if it's not working, you're probably not following the directions right. Christianity says like, oh, do exactly this. Don't pay attention to any other religion. Don't blend religions. Like, we have a system. And part of the reason why it went viral, quote unquote, is like that it works. Like if you are, it's not like Christianity is false. If you follow its precepts and then live your life fully devoted as a Christian, you will go to heaven, and you will avoid like being trapped in hell. Like, I'm going to transport like Tartarus. Like, you won't get trapped in Tartarus. You'll go to the Elysian Fields. Like, if you're fully Christian. But that in another religion, there's another way to navigate that. Like, that whatever. So it is like a magical system. But like we don't all need to follow the protocols that the clergy follows, and that's a later invention of control,
Yeah. And two, like, I think that like the emphasis on afterlife is really, I mean, maybe it's not a moot point, but like it's not that important. Like, I look to like more like Jewish writing where the importance and the weight that Christianity placed on afterlife and heavenly rewards and stuff, I find that to be almost a dogmatic thing and like part of the church. What the church was, it needed a buy-in, and a wonderful afterlife was kind of that. But if you look at something like kind of the Greek afterlife, that it's kind of dreary. There might be different stations, even to look at something like Norse afterlife concepts, or the idea of reincarnation, which I think is kind of the backbone of a lot of it, is that there's something on the other side that you go back into in whatever capacity that is. But the weight placed on afterlife is really kind of minuscule for me. It doesn't really resonate. But the idea of exorcism, the idea of working with those spirits, that's something that they reserved for clergy, like within the church. But Jesus's real message was, y'all can do this. Like, you can cast out demons. You should be casting out demons. You should be cleansing and purifying your lives. And I look at that as kind of the main message. And that's what he was training all those disciples to do, was to cast out demons. And, when you say perform miracles, that's, magical workings. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. And then when you look at something like Simon Magus, who was willing to pay for Jesus's instruction and wanted to learn that, but had his own kind of method of that. You realize that there were a lot of people practicing this kind of art of what we could argue is goetia.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, definitely. And then there's, I understand what you're saying about the afterlife as like, the church really kind of just, as it got convoluted, in a society kind of sense, it kind of like blew out of proportion its best features, like that it could cast out demons and that it dealt with death and with the post-mortem state, because like any community has to have someone who's doing that, but it doesn't have to be like a carrot on the stick and kind of a bribe, but it's like, but that these people who, like, doing goetia kind of were able to kind of navigate that space between life and death and kind of make spirits either kind of behave or fuck off, and like that. Yeah, like a lot of the technology of it just got turned into a kind of a mechanism of control, and even like that they were wandering the roads doing this stuff and developing ritual like technology is you can kind of see in certain what's the book is called, like I think it's called Through the Eye of the Needle, and it like focuses a lot on the pagan world becoming the Christian world, and how it was largely like an economic transition. And so you're like, well, why were these itinerant magicians just kind of wandering around and starting these cults? And it makes sense that, in a big economic shift, that there'd be people kind of like put into like a state of transience, that used to be rooted in communities, but now they're kind of having to like take flight because the economic structure has been disturbed,
Yeah. I mean, you could even see that today, as people are kind of are considering the spirituality as less of a token component of their lives and more integral, that a lot of times there's kind of this push-pull feeling of the modern kind of consumer-based culture versus the spiritual culture that is growing, that oftentimes feels in conflict with it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, for sure. And seeing like how much materialism like belongs in spirituality, like as people are like, like the difference between spirituality and religion and magic and mysticism, people are starting to, without even maybe necessarily like intellectually grappling with that, I can see just what in people's behavior that they're starting to figure out how much stuff like belongs in their spirituality, and that because it is becoming more physically grounded and about like the world you live in, it's essentially becoming more animist naturally, that it's like, oh no, there's some things in there, but it doesn't mean that they're all for sale, but some of them can be, and just it kind of normalizing, but also, and it kind of almost kind of diffusing into the communities and into the way people live their lives. But like you said, not being like a token. I feel like spirituality was kind of caught for a long time in a thing that was almost like paper thin. Like people were like, oh, well, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. And you're like, well, like, I mean, it's like, I'm not going to give it my soul. I'm just going to give it kind of like my whimsy or something,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like kind of saying like, yeah, like we can have sex, but I'm not going to say I love you, like.
Yeah. I think it's been wording that like, in order to be religious, you have to be a part of the big three, or you have to, I think that, commitment is really difficult. I think that's kind of, to even go back into Goetia, that commitment to forming relationships versus just like a cold call in the night, with no, build up to it. I think that, you kind of form your own religion in a way, and it's not the kind of thing that we think about when we think about Christianity as like an organization. You could see it as a microcosm of organization within your own life that doesn't necessarily have to have any other adherence to your religion. But I think that being religious is really adopting a practice that's more than just lighting some candles, every now and then, and taking a bath, with some candles, or a bath bomb. I don't know.
Yeah. I see. I gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting with maybe that's kind of a good place to leave it. That was, I think we kind of covered a lot of bases, and it was interesting that talking about goetia brought us all the way here,
back to religion.
Yeah, because it makes total sense, and it could go on forever. I'm like, lots of things are popping into my head to continue with, but I think this is kind of a good point to let people digest. But maybe like one last thing, like what about bed knobs and broomsticks?
I think it's very interesting that for me looking at it, it has a seal of Astaroth, which still has that component of the star, and you have in the opening credits, there's a lot of really rich imagery, even like Lucifuge Rofocal is in there. I think there were some, people that were at least familiarizing themselves with the occult when they made the film, and realizing that there's kind of a tradition to English magic, because that's definitely what's being highlighted there. It was a very interesting to watch as an adult, because I remember watching it as a child and having no clue what I was, really getting into. What are your thoughts on it?
I was just like, thought it was really funny that you brought it up, because like I was telling you in message that we went to the Glastonbury Occult Conference, and Paul Weston was giving a presentation and talking about Dion Fortune, and he was kind of like, I challenge anyone in this room to watch this movie and not see Angela Lansbury as Dion Fortune. Like it just will reveal itself to be the case. But yeah, like totally like what you're saying. There's some sort of recognition that there is a long-standing tradition of English magic. But yeah, with that and goetia and the church in general, I think one of the main things that we were talking about that we kept kind of pushing at is that like goetia can take you out into the experience of your own landscape and the experience of your own life, and interact with it and kind of have a feedback back and forth, and that movies like Bed Knobs and Broomstick are in life, and that like churches are in your neighborhood, and they're also in life, they're in reality, and that like all of those things through a regular practice will start to take on a kind of like goetic glimmer.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Well, where can people find you, or what are you up to next, or etc.?
So currently, you can find me on my Instagram account, which is the Peacock Grimoire. And you can also, if you're in the Denver area, I work at Ritualcravt, and that's ritualcravt.com, and the craft has a V. And I teach classes through that. I also have a Patreon account, which is where a lot of my current work is being funneled into, as a way for people to kind of engage with that in a little bit more of a personal setting than, say, Instagram. But yeah, right now I'm working on some stuff with The Long Lost Friend and 6th and 7th Books of Moses.
Oh, cool.
I recently did some work around my ancestry, and I'm starting to look at Pennsylvania Dutch folk practices, and how that kind of has a grimoire tradition to it, and has Cyprian work with it, and even has some conjure in there too. So
yeah. I would love to have you back on and talk about that at some point. And
sure.
Yeah, there's like a couple other people in my circle that interface with that. It might be fun to have a kind of like panel discussion at some point about that stuff.
Oh yeah, that would be cool.
And also you've been working on a text about the Watchers.
Yeah, that has been a long process. That it started out as kind of a system, I guess, is like the initial kind of idea behind it. But in working with it and through my own just development, realizing that the world doesn't need another system of magic for dealing with spirits, but that personal experiences and sharing those are a little bit more important. So the book is being, or the text is being edited in a way where it's going to highlight more of the poetry that's gone into my ritual work, the
cool.
invocations and stuff like that. So it's a little bit more authentic to me, and less about the ego of creating a new system. And yeah, it's been a process. I'm not really forcing it. It could be released, it could be finished in a year or so. It could be finished when I'm 40, which actually isn't that far away. But yeah, that's kind of where that is. And I'm just happy as it is right now, with where it is. I'm finding a lot of really interesting work out of the Ides Moon rituals I'm doing at Ritualcravt. I was invited to present at the International Necromancy Consortium next year in New Orleans. And so I'm going to do a presentation on community ritual with grimoires and necromancy, and yeah, so.
Fantastic. Cool. Well, yeah, I'd love to talk to you again about a bunch of those different points. So let's just stay in touch.
Sure.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Chris.